purposes. But before I start with a brief presentation, just a couple of things as an introductory notes. First, when we speak about the ways ICTY is perceived here at the field in space or area or former Yugoslavia, generally you have two perceptions. First one is as some kind that ICTY is some kind of or contribution to some kind of establishing of international criminal justice, which is of course imperfect but actually continuous progressive process, which goes together like with this newly and very popular term of world governance. We are not speaking about the, well, world government as everybody was hoping for 25 years ago, but today it's a process imperfect with the problems and so on, but actually world governance is kind of functioning generally. On the other hand, we have this other, if we could call this first one normative, let me say this other one is more realistic or factual approach, which says that ICTY is some kind of geopolitical instrument of the big powers, basically, who had been managing actually this space for the last 2 centuries and even are the most important for understanding the processes in the 90s and even in the 80s, which were preceding actually the actual process of dissolution or dismemberment of Yugoslavia. And actually this ICTY as a part of this geopolitical instrument is intended to use and abuse idea of justice or international justice for the goals of intended geopolitical goals on geopolitical rearrangement of the whole this process. Actually, I think that for both people trust in there that you can find the arguments for both of this presentation. Personally, I think that this second one could be more defended with more actual arguments. So actually, we in this morning session, speaking about the book of Bachman and Fatic, in which they also have many of material which is helping to understand how problematic is the practice of the work of the ICTY. I would just briefly remind for a couple of more things, like the case of Haradinaj, which is, I think, disgraceful for the idea of the justice. You remember actually that he was liberated due to the fact that more than 10 witnesses were killed during the process. And actually what is even interesting and very problematic is that he was defended by the advocacy of the firm of the Cherry Boot, of course using the wife of Tony Blair, using all the possibilities to defend Haradinaj in all the possible ways. Then one more thing that came up to my mind today, actually, I didn't notice in the book, in this brief overview, like, is the financing of the ICTY, which is very interesting, actually, who was paying for that, and the role of George Soros and his contribution and the way that he could maybe influence even the practice and so on. For me, it's very interesting approach and so on. And before I go, one more about contribution. You were also writing about this rewriting or writing of historical narratives. And actually what is very interesting for me, you know, this case of Audrey Budding, this, how we could call that, elaborate from 2003, in which she was presenting the case of Serbian nationalism in 20th century, trying to actually bring it in support of the idea of joint criminal entrepreneurship and so on. On the other hand, you have the Catholic Church, I mean, which actually 10 years ago, the famous Darko Hudolist investigation actually, in which Monsignor Živko Kustić publicly explained actually the way in which Catholic Church from 75 until 84 was preparing the solution of Yugoslavia, preparing Croatians all over Yugoslavia for the further dissolution, and it was directly, publicly accepted and even cheered crime against Yugoslavia, and they were insisting actually, of course, for the case of internal fights within Croatia, to explain that they were the most deserved for the execution of Yugoslavia and murdering of Yugoslavia. But as far as I know, nobody talked upon that, correct me if I'm wrong, at ICTY, or nobody spoke about the role of Catholic Church and so on, which is very problematic. And now, going back to the basic argument, actually, which is going to be directly opposed to what Klaus was insisting that was good contribution of traditional justice. For the very idea of ad hoc tribunal and selective justice, I find it is itself deeply problematic. But many examples show that ICTY primarily was a practical instrument for influencing the daily political process in the Balkans in the direction of the interest of financiers, basically United States, UK, Soros, and so on, all under the auspices of the UN. And this was intended to be my contribution, because basically it was, especially in Serbia and even in Croatia afterwards, spoken about the ICTY as a way of rewriting of the history. But actually I'm more interested for the practical influence of the ICTY since '93 onwards as a way for influencing domestic politics, which Klaus insisted that was good contribution of ICTY, which I disagree. For example, apparent is, and I will start with this, basically race-based framework that through such court imposes the general concept of responsibility only to domestic players. For all the unfortunate events and crimes resulting in the wars in the former Yugoslavia, ICTY blames exclusively local actors and cut all links that point to a deep involvement of big Western powers. It goes so far as to reject all the requests to be brought before the court as witnesses former political and military leaders of the United States, Britain, Germany, etc., although they deeply influenced the process in Yugoslavia. We could also speak about the private organizations like Blackwater or MPRI, who directly influenced happenings in Croatia, for example, and so on. Then, in the book Shadow Play by a British journalist, Tim Marshall, he points to the use of the institution of the Hague Tribunal at the time of preparation of the armed aggression on Yugoslavia, Federal Republic Yugoslavia in '99. So, well, the British senior officers have made direct telephone calls to its Yugoslav counterparts and soon-to-be opponents, warning them to take care what they do, meaning that if they defend their country, they could finish in the tribunal. So the tribunal, as an institution, was directly used to undermine the defensive power of the country that is soon attacked by NATO. In accordance with this, it is necessary to remind ourselves that the indictment of Slobodan Milošević and Arkan were announced just after the beginning of the aggression in '99. So, and this is crucial, at the time when Arkan's military unit actually helped NATO forces to be deployed in Bosnia in '95, the indictment for his involvement in previous wars either did not exist or was irrelevant for their practical purposes until the beginning of the new war in '99, when it was publicly announced as a kind of blackmail or warning. The same function ICTY played also during the intelligence preparation of the October the 5th, when many high-ranking police and military officers crossed to the other side, thanks to the promise that it can help them to avoid the extradition process in The Hague. So we therefore point to the daily political use of the Hague Tribunal as an instrument of interfering, influencing, and managing the current and not only the previous politics. Crucial example is, I think, this notorious case of Vojislav Šešelj, of whom I think all the worst as a person, but he spent almost 12 years in ICTY, held without a verdict, with worsening health, for the only reason not to influence domestic politics, and he was returned actually to Serbia because of the wrong assessment that he could endanger the Vučić regime. So actually in the meantime, on the March 31st of 2016, he was liberated. They passed the verdict that actually he was, so if it be also at the appeal confirmed, it will come out that he spent like almost 12 years without any reason in Hague, only not to influence domestic policies, as its famous statement when Djindjic said to Carla Del Ponte, take him and not return to Serbia, please, anymore. Hague is in this way used not only against Serbia and Serbs, but more and more against the others. Couple of cases. Trial to Gotovina and Markac was used as a kind of blackmail against Croatians to change and arrest political leadership unsuitable for, at that time, big power goals. When Croatia returned to the desired track, the verdict was overturned by the appellate court. Currently, in the same way is used ICTY's verdict against the military leaders of Herceg Bosnia in the case of Prlic, Praljak and the others, as a form of pressure on Croatia and Croats from Bosnia and Herzegovina to support the process of repackaging Dayton, which they still refuse. The same can be seen at Kosovo, and timing is, I think, of crucial importance. Why now we have a tribunal for Kosovo leaders? And I'm coming to the end. The Hague Tribunal is therefore, I think, very strong geopolitical weapon of major Western powers used to control and direct the politics in the ex-Yugoslavia countries. And finally, what I insisted today already, it unfortunately didn't contribute to reconciliation. When you take a look about the situation, especially the headlines of the news, everybody is really much frightened of the possibility of new war at the Balkans at the moment. Thank you.